So this is the story of the alphabets of life. In the last two chapters, we saw how the process of letter making applied first to the human body, and in terms of breathing, and then to human motions. In the next two chapters, we see how this principle gets applied to the whole of the universe. Because the alphabet is not just about communicating, it's about ordering the universe. And so here we're going to start to see how it applies to the heavens. So one of the accounts of how the letters got started is that they started in looking at the sky. Here is an example from the runes where each of the 12 signs of the zodiac is an individual rune. Here is an early version from the Phoenicians. The early Slavic tradition had a much more complicated version. So here is one of those old versions where you see 12 signs linking up with the 12 zodiac signs. And then a complex grid system with a great number of those signs. And if you look more closely at the first one, here you have the F going down and the F going up, a sign that we already saw in the magical alphabets of Egypt. The full Russian system is much more complicated than just having 12 signs for the 12 zodiac signs. Within that, you have a number of signs for each, linking up with key stars. And if you look at the second one, it's again a little man. So this notion of the alphabets of life, of living beings, keeps coming back in unexpected places. Well, and you notice some signs like this one, which is linked with Ketu in your country, but I won't go through all of them. The simple point is this: the letters are linked with stars and planets. In ancient Egypt, there was a section of the hieroglyphs specifically for the sky, another one for plants, and another one for living human beings. And here are some of the symbols linked with the sky. Of particular interest is Saturn, because Saturn is shown as a man, and it's almost like the Libra sign. And of course, in the sky, Saturn is particularly linked, or your Shani, as you would call him, is particularly linked with October, November. The ancient Egyptians, as I told you, had a special alphabet for each of the zodiac signs and for each of the planets. So these are the planets of Mercury, Cancer, and Scorpio. And you see the signs, and then below the Arabic letters corresponding to each. And then the ancient Arabs had a very complex system called the science of the sand. And how do you do this? You take your hand and you push it into the sand and get 5 dots. And then you get 2 sets of these, and then you get a triangle. And then you get 1 dot, 2 dots, 3 dots, 4 dots. And if you notice closely, you realize that these dots are in fact the equivalent of this of the Zephiroth in the other tradition of the Hebrews. And then you can reduce this to lines, and then you can combine lines and dots. But instead of having 3 or 6 lines as you have in the Chinese tradition, you now have combinations of 2 dots and 2 lines, and you get these variants. And this applies not only to the Arabs in Saudi Arabia and so on. This is also still found today in Pakistan. So it probably covers the whole of Middle Asia. And offers an alternative way of organizing the whole of the world. So what you get is you get alphabets made of these signs, and then magical alphabets, and then magical alphabets linking up with planets and stars. And here is a general account showing how you move from one sign to another, and how that leads then to an F sign. Here you have the Phoenician alphabet based on a series of constellations. Here is another version of the constellations. So it's important to realize it wasn't just somebody that got up one day and said, oh, I'm going to name that A, B, C, D. There was a system, and then somebody thought of a better system, and so they did that. And then that system got abstracted, and that became then the alphabet of the Phoenicians, with number T, Th, number 9, being this sign that we now link with the moon. The Hebrews, as I mentioned in the introductory section, had one linked with the stars and with Psalm 119. They also had an alphabet of the stars, and they had a celestial Hebrew alphabet where they had on the one hand, the Hebrew letters, and on the other hand, the star letters. And in fact, there were a number of these sacred languages. So what is called the celestial alphabet, the alphabet of the angels, and the passing of the river in the Chaldean system becomes Chaldean 1, Chaldean 8, and Chaldean 10. Now, the ancient Christianity went a lot further, and I'm going to put on my glasses because these are too small for the moment. So the 12 zodiac signs become linked with 3 stages in redemption. So there's the Redeemer, the Redeemed, and then the new Redeemer. And or you can link this with the 12 zodiac signs and specific moments in the Bible. So Virgo gets linked with the Virgin Mary, Libra with the sin that must be paid for, Scorpio with the sin that brings death, your Mula, and then Sagittarius, demonism, Capricorn, earth corruption, and then Pisces, God's remnant, Aries, sacrifice, and then finally Taurus, the resurrection, and Leo, the king. And then the whole of the Bible is organized according to those same principles. Well, when we look at the Bible in this way, we start to see that what we think of as the Bible written somewhere between 1200 BC and 280 AD, when it was first translated into Greek, is part of a much bigger story. So in the Christian version, we have Sagittarius. Well, Sagittarius is a Greek story, but in the Christian version, you will see Christ as Sagittarius killing the devil. And the devil is Scorpio, your Mula. Well, the tail of Scorpio is called Mula. And Mula is interesting because one of its meanings is original sin, but it is also in the nakshatras. In the old version it's 17, and in the new version it's 19. And of course 19 is again 100 if we do the gematria from the West. And so it's the end and the beginning at the same time. And so Christ kills the Scorpio and life goes on. But that idea of a Sagittarius, a man horse, if I go back to the ancient Armenians, 17 to 19,000 BC, what do I have? I have a man, here is the equivalent of a man shooting an arrow back then, and a backward swastika. And so there is a much, of course the Bible is written, But the myths, the stories behind it go back into the darknesses of time. And in your country, in India, you have the notion of Arunachala. You have a mountain in the south, and it's there where light is reborn. Supposedly Kartika comes, and you have Kartika fires lit in the way that we light the fires on the hills around Easter time. And Shiva as a light is supposed to shoot out into the sky. Now, fascinatingly enough, here's a picture of Shiva as the pillar of light. And here in the Hebrew tradition, you have the notion of the Shekinah, of a pillar of light going off into heaven. And so there are very curious parallels between the stories of the Hebrews, the Christians, and the Hindus at a very deep level. And one of the great figures of the sky, besides Kartika, or Christ who acts as the savior, is a figure called Ophiuchus, who, I've forgotten his name now, but he is also in the Indian traditions, but he fights the Scorpio, and he fights this big snake. And here you see him in a medieval version where the snake is, well, he's fighting it right at the balance of Libra. And there are stars concerned that are 8-sided stars, and they return in the northern traditions of Europe. But this is a much bigger story. So if we look at the sky as a whole, we see the Milky Way, which we all know. But most of us are not aware that the Milky Way isn't just a straight river. It's a river that splits in two and has an island here. And then there's the path of the sun that is in the form of a curve, and it crosses it once here in the springtime and once here in the autumn. And this is called Anath. Well, Anath, this is where something happens, and here is where life happens. And so it's when the sun crosses this island in the sky that you create the first of life. And this gets linked with the swastikas. And if you look at the Chinese version, you see this symbol. If you look very closely at this symbol, you see here is a swastika going one way and the swastika going the other way. And here in this decoration of the god Perun, you see swastikas going both ways again. And here in this tarot card, you see swastikas on both sides. And in fact, we saw it in the church, and in also the Ha and the Tha, the sun and the moon. So in the first part of the year, the sun is, the energy is growing, it's getting lighter every day, so it's dominated by the sun, by Surya. The second part of the year, the light is diminishing, and everything is controlled by the moon, or dominated by the moon, by Chandra. And so what did people do? They started to conceive Earth as in heaven, and started to build cities where there were islands in rivers. So, an obvious and most important example in India is Haridwar. But if you go to Rome, the Isla Tiburtina and the Tiber, or if you go to Paris, the Ile-de-France, which is where France began long before it was a country, because there was there was Paris, then there was Ile-de-France, and then there was the area around Paris, and then gradually it became into the country. And if you go through the world, if you go to Budapest or Prague or all the great cities of Europe and of India, you will find that there's always Kashi has it as well, or Varanasi, or Benares, depending on which school you've been brought up on. But all of these places have this island, which makes no sense until you realize it's a mirror of what's happening in the sky. And so you can look at the sky then as 12 zodiac signs, and then you can see, you can put a pillar, and that becomes the Jed pillar, which we saw with an Ankh on top of it yesterday. And then, of course, the division line at the top is between Scorpio, death, and then Sagittarius, life. And then in this version, Sagittarius is shooting ahead, but then in the Christian version, he turns around to kill the Scorpio. So these animals are all about organizing the world so that it can fit into a story. Now, I'm saying things that in the narrow Christian view are terrible, because the Christian view is this is all the truth and there is no adjustment, it's the way God did it. But if we look at it historically, this isn't to say that God didn't do it, but that the problem is God is up there and he is infinite, and we are down here and we are finite, and we have to explain things in our terms. And we think we're explaining it in God's terms, but we can't. And so we have holy books that try to make sense of things, and an alphabet tries to make sense of things. But the extent that it doesn't reflect the full truth is really the fact that we don't quite get it. And then if we're tempted to blame God, but really it's just because we're a bit too simple ourselves sometimes. Now, it's not only the men that are involved, you'll be relieved to know, it's also the women. So the woman becomes the symbol of the universe, and in ancient Egypt, it is a goddess who is the Milky Way. And the goddess always has a spiral here, and this is already back in 5000 BC. And then we have this symbol, which we saw yesterday again, of the diamond shape with a square. That is called the field, but it's also the womb. And you get various versions of that. And you get very complicated dances where that creates a kind of labyrinth. And then you get versions that look like this, and like this, and like this. And so what starts as a purely primitive thing, possibly as early as 20,000 years ago, slowly evolves into systematic geometrical shapes, which then in some cases are also letters of early runic alphabets. So what we see happening here is this gradual imposition on nature, on organic forms, of geometrical forms. And that continues until it becomes a systematic approach. So here is an ancient Egyptian drawing which shows a beetle going around, and these are the 7 planets. And then here's another version that links it again with the planets. Here is a complicated version that shows us this double spiral, but now each of those little points is actually one of the 64 trigrams or hexagrams of the I Ching. So the I Ching is, on the one hand, a book in a series of 64 situations, but you can visualize that as a sphere, and you can visualize this as a double spiral. You can also visualize the whole year as 2 of these semi-spirals, and you get a yin-yang figure. In the ancient Greek stories, there were cranes that danced and created such a spiral. And there are early letters, this is in those karuna of the ancient Slavs, that is also a spiral. So the making of spirals, the making of geometry is on the one hand a way of making letters, and then on the other hand, it's a way of organizing the world. And then once you do that, you can start to link all of these things together. So we have Taurus, who is drawn here already in the prehistoric caves. That gets linked with stories like Theseus killing the Minotaur and so on, that you make sculptures of. Then you get labyrinths, and then you draw Theseus killing the Minotaur in the labyrinth. And here you start to get decorations, including the geometrical pattern version of what we now see as the swastika. So what you're doing is you're organizing the world, creating stories for it, and those stories then get linked with geometrical patterns. And then it goes further. So I can take those geometrical patterns on a human body. I can do a spiral and link it with 20 names and make a grid for the gods. Then I can make that into a portable temple that I was telling you about amongst the ancient Slavics, called a capiche, that can be as big as something that you can put on a cigarette box, and it can be here a whole field. Or in a mini version, as we saw the other day, we just get 3 trees and put 3 symbols on it. And if we go to the great churches of Christianity, what do we find? Here in Amiens, we see labyrinths. And then if you look closely, you see swastikas on the ground here. And then one is the dark part is the swastika, and here it's the light part. So figure ground things, which is a theme to which I'll return again in one of the appendices. But what's important is I can take, once I get my geometry in place, I can apply it to the body, to an object, or even in the church where I pray to my Creator. And it goes further. So if we all know about the Chinese zodiac and the zodiac animals. There are 12 of them, and they linked in with a 60-year cycle. And there are 2 important ones for our story, the dragon and the snake. In the modern version, they are just to the left of the center, and they are also to the left here. But in the old versions, and here's an old version, you see that they're centered. And so to the left of the center, so this is the yang and this is the yin. This is midsummer, this is midwinter, yes? And here we have the dragon, and there we have the snake. So the dragon descends to heaven, the snake goes back to heaven. And here is the ancient symbol for a snake in ancient Chinese, Qi. Well, we call him Draco, and here he is in the ancient Russian alphabet. Here he is in ancient Greek. He is called Stigma, I'm sorry. So, but he is actually Draco in the sky. And then as things go on, people realize that stigma is linked with, it's linked with the 6th position that you link with Ketu, and of course Rahu and Ketu. So positions 1 and 6 are linked with the solstices. And this then gets linked with evil. And so, therefore, you have to get rid of that letter. And so, stigma, now if you say, oh, he has a stigma, meaning there's something wrong with him. Well, they had to get rid of this, they replaced this letter in Old Greek, but because it's a snake. And this is one of the reasons why somehow Satan gets linked with position 6, 15, and 24. And if you add the gematria of that, you get 666. And that, of course, is the number of the beast, and so on. But all of that is completely incomprehensible if you don't know that it links back to the nakshatras, which I'll talk about in Appendix 3. But for the moment, we're realizing that we have a sky, we link the sky to letters, and so we have the snake going here, then we have F, where the short form is also a snake, and then Z is also a kind of snake. And then in the Russian version, I have the snake going this way and the snake going that way. Yes, in two versions. And so what's happening in the sky then becomes represented by a snake going this way and that way. In the Russian, it still remains. In the Greek, we get rid of the snakes because that gets linked with evil and the devil. And so I wrote a book on the story of the skies for this reason, because most of us don't know anything of this. And we wouldn't think of thinking of S as a snake, but of course the S is also, well, we'll see more of that in a moment. So in the Persian, well, in your tradition, you have the Devas and the Asuras fighting each other. Now, and that gets very complicated because you get 88 Devas and 92 Asuras. And it's 92 Asuras till the summer solstice, and then the Devas take over again. And you have two great snakes in Persia, and they are fighting to capture the world egg. And in ancient ancient Greece, you have the mother goddess with two big snakes. And here you see, well, and you have then the E sign and the reversed E sign. But where does that come from? Well, this is the pattern of the sun, if you use the globe as a whole. Here is a symbol of the mysteries, where they use the S, or the backward S and the backward Z. And here are again letters. Here's an ornamental version of the letter Xi, which are now two snakes. Remember, we saw those two snakes and then the knot. And here you see then, again, we were talking about this coming up on clothes. Well, here you see then the swastikas both ways there. So we're making sense of the skies. We use geometry, and parts of those geometry become symbols, and parts of those symbols break down into letters. Well, in the Christian tradition, we have three key letters, I, H, and S. The easy version is this is in hoc signo, in this sign, using the Latin, but it's also the short form for the letter Jesus. But if you think of it, if you think of the H as the Milky Way, so this is the Tropic of Cancer and the Tropic of Capricorn, and the sun is going between the two of them. Yes? And so I can draw the two pillars rather than three pillars, and I can do the sun intertwining. Well, of course, or I can just draw one pillar and the sun intertwining. So this can be Jesus. It can be Isis in the old version, not the new version. And of course, this is the dollar sign. And you find this on ancient tombs. And then it becomes the symbol of the Jesuits with three arrows, which we now link with the three sufferings of Christ, but they, in your tradition, would be the Ichna, Jnana, and the Kriya. And here are four symbols of the four elements, where this comes again. And here is another Christian version that branches from this, called the Lanteri Christians. So what starts as geometry becomes letters, that again then become recombined as symbols to represent the whole of cosmology. We have Rahu and Ketu, and Rahu and Ketu are not planets in the west, but they are in the east, and they are the points where the path of the sun intersects with the path of the moon. And it's only two places, and those two places, when they intersect, and not every time because they intersect frequently, but sometimes when they intersect, then that causes an eclipse. And so the symbol in the west for this is a Y, and an upside down Y is the other one. And then that leads to a whole set of symbols, including a chalice and a turned down chalice. And of course, in your country, it links up with a sign that you see at the back of a python. I'll come to that when I talk about stories of the skies. But again, what I'm pointing out here is that, and you can have an upside down V and a V, and you can have other signs. So what starts as trying to make sense of the skies leads to symbols, leads to letters. The Chinese do the same, but they use two animals, the dragon and the turtle, and do their symbols on this and use that to create a map of early heaven and later heaven. And in your country, in the north, in the south, this was probably in the north and it went south, and then in the north you had another version, but you have then your four major great symbols, and then you have the 12 signs of the zodiac. You also have a round version, and this is now your yugas, and you have, of course, 4 yugas, and this one starts in 11,500 BC, which, according to some, is when the Mahabharata wars start. We'll come back to this because the number of years are involved again in our breathing story, which we talked about later, or before, but I'll go into greater detail later on. So we create two kinds of orders, the archetypal order and the order of change. 8 primal trigrams, 8 temporal trigrams, a dragon chart, a turtle chart, earlier heaven, later heaven, fixed signs, movable signs, Maharshi and Brahmarshi, unmanifest and manifest. And in your country, I keep saying your country, but I mean your part of the world, because what you do here in Nepal links so intimately with India and Bengal and Pakistan and Afghanistan. So you have your chart for doing your horoscopes. Now I take that chart and I put names of gods here. So Mahavishnu, Parambrahma, Sadashiva, and Vasudeva. I divide this one into 2 and split him into 3. And so I have Narayana in 3 versions, and then that gives me the basis of creation. So it's 1/8 of reality that creates the whole universe. And you know that story a lot better than me, so I won't go into all the details, but it's just that we use the same geometry to do horoscopes, to tell the story of creation, and then link this then with elements that are then also letters. And then there are a whole series of different varieties of how you do this, so you can create charts like this. Amongst the Chinese tend to call them mountains, so you have a 24 mountains chart. The ancient Slavs and the ancient ancient people all over the world use the turtle, including there's an ancient turtle also in India. And then there is a version amongst in Mithraism, where there is a turtle, but the turtle opens up and a man comes out of the turtle, and he has the signs around that. And then here are Egyptian ones. And then it gets really interesting when we go to Iran, because we inherit things from the Indian tradition, but we rearrange the world. So we have our 12 zodiac signs, but we now align it with 7 days and 7 gods. And then you create a heptagram, so a 7-sided polygon, and then you join all the sides of that polygon, and that creates then the basic relationships that we know. And if you then join the lines in this way, you create the Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday pattern. And this then, so I can have the 7 gods, Mithra, Ma, Gayamar, Zamyat, Tyr, Anahita, Bahram, and Mithra again. Sun, Moon, Jupiter, Saturn, Mercury, Venus, Mars. Then other names for them as powers, linking with kingdom, cattle, human, earth, vegetable, water, fire, and then with these nakshatras, and create a whole Oriental theosophy. And this Oriental theosophy, which was founded in Iran, or Iran, goes all the way to Japan. And there is, even today, there is a Japanese system based on all of this that not many people know about. Well, the Chinese create 28 Shui, HSUI, which are your nakshatras, and do their version. The Christians link this with a hexagram and have the 4 animals, which then become the 4, well, they start as the 4 royal stars, become the 4 royal animals, and then become the 4 evangelists of the Bible, who supposedly wrote the Bible. And then you create a cube, a square of 25 squares, and you have Sator, Arepas, Tenet, Opera, Ropa. So the plower who holds, well, he holds the things in shape. This is a kind of anagram, so you take 4 letters and keep rearranging them. Now, here you have the cross of Malta, and you are linking different letters. Here you have a tarot card, and you are doing the same things. So there is, again, an ordering of the universe. The tarot cards are not just for playing, they are for organizing the whole of the universe. So what we see is that the ordering of the sky and the ordering of the earth and the using of letters and geometry are all intercombined. And the greater the system, the more details that gets into. In the lecture on the breathing, I showed you that there was a magic square with 9 numbers. Well, there is a magic square not only in the West. That magic square is linked with Saturn or your Shani. But in India, there are 9 magic squares, and each of them arranges those 9 numbers differently. Now, I'm not going to go into all the details. All I'm going to show you is this is an Indian magic square, a set of magic squares. Here is a mystic tablet of the persons from Tibet. And what do they have in the center? A magic square. Here are 2 Russian versions, which on the one hand reflect the trigrams that you have from China. But if you look in the center, what do we have? A magic square again. And here we have a Bulgarian calendar, a magic square here, and the signs of the zodiac above. And here is a more complicated case, which also has stars around here. So, although the outer appearance varies considerably, the fundamental idea of using magic squares is something that applies across the continents. And as I showed you in the one on breathing, is also one of the ways that you create the first 9 letters, which are supposedly the first 9 letters that Allah gave to Muhammad in the Islamic story. And here you see those same, that same magic square in a Christian context, and here you see it linked with letters. And here is the big picture of what that chart looks like. So each planet has its own square. So you have a 3 by 3 square for Saturn, a 4 by 4 square for the next planet, and going right up to a 9 by 9 square. And this chart is immensely, we could spend 20 hours on this chart, but you'll be relieved to know we're not going to do that. Here I show you just some examples of how geometry then gets applied to increasingly complex combinations. We saw how this initial diamond shape with an X was a symbol of the womb and the field, but how it also was a letter of the alphabet in the runic sense, and how that then expands here in Northern Europe to become that. Here we are dealing with versions of the Purusha, and then you create complicated vastus, and this becomes not only a way for creating the ground, but also for knowing where to place all the gods. So in the most simple versions, you have the Kalachakra that gives you gods in the 8 directions. But in the more complicated ones, you have 64 or 81 gods, and they are linked via these same squares. And then you get the Purusha here, who gets linked then with the chakras, and then you get your symbolic man who lies on the ground. Where his head is, you get one kind of tower. Where his feet is, you get another kind of tower. And where his middle section is, or his linga is, Freud would love it, you get a special kind of tower. And here you see various alignments. And this is a ground view of the same thing, where you now see the chakras from above. And in fact, this is now where we're really coming down to earth now, because we have the heavens in order, but now we apply the same principles to our monuments on earth that become a way of understanding earth and heaven. So I have 5 elements, which are the first 5 letters, but I can make a 5 element stupa like this with a bindu nada, and visarga on top, or I can make a stupa in this way with 13 levels of knowledge, or 13 bhumis this way, or I can do a monumental one as in Bodhanath. Here is a more complicated version that shows you in more detail how this works. Now, it's not my intention to go into all the details again, but what I'm saying is that when we build this, we are building not just a monument to our deities, we are building, on the one hand, the first 5 letters of the alphabet. On the other hand, we are building a model of the whole universe that can be very simple. In its simplest forms, it's just 4 kinds of stones, and in Japan you'll find them, they're about this high. But they can also be pagodas that are up to 50 or 60 meters high. And here it gets interesting again. I can build a pyramid this way of sounds. And so I get a pyramid of sounds that predates the Pascal's triangle by 1400 years. And so this whole thing becomes a way of showing the combination of syllable sounds 300 years before Christ. And so, again, the making of sounds, this is called the Meru pyramid, of course, because it's Mount Meru. So the Meru pyramid is a way of creating a vocal or an oral version of Kailash, but a Kailash that in fact creates the world. And in Japan, just for example, you have five element stupa. Here are the Japanese names: Korin, Furin, Karin, Suirin, Kirin. They are the gem-shaped ring of space, the reclining half-moon shape representing wind, the triangular ring of fire, the spherical water ring, and the square earth ring. So, elements, geometry, physical objects, which, as we already know, link up with letters. And so the ordering of the letters is an ordering of the geometry, is an ordering of the world. And having done that on the scale of a little thing like this, or even a little altar that we have at home, I can do it to Borobudur. This is one of the greatest of all the monuments on this basis. And you see, on the one hand, you see this incredible thing with, this is the whole cosmos now in a single building with a stupa on top. But if we look at it in more detail, what do I have? I have my Vitruvian man again in the center, yes? And I go down, and what do I have? I have combinations of my magic square numbers again, in various combinations. And so I build a single stupa that is geometry, but it again hides the magical geometry that is the magic behind the creation of the universe. And there are wonderful documentaries about this statue, because it is infinitely complicated. Well, they have written books about this, so I will not go into it here. My point for this lecture is simply to say, we have a story of the alphabet, but it is linked with the whole story of Eastern architecture, well, with world architecture, sacred architecture. And I'm just giving you isolated examples of how that works. And so I can take the 7 planets and I can put them in the order from the furthest to the nearest. So Saturn, Jupiter, Moon, Sun, Venus, Mercury, Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Sun, Venus, Mercury, Moon. And that is one cycle, or I can, it's called the Saturn alpha cycle, and that is linked with inhaling. And now I exhale, and then I go from Saturn down to the Moon. Now I can link this to my 25 squares of the 25 letters, right? And then I get B, G, D, K, P, T. I can link that with the 7 planets. And then I can link this with a whole cosmology. Forgive my glasses because the writing is a bit small. So this becomes the 1st chakra, 2nd chakra, 3rd chakra, 4th chakra, 5th chakra, 6th chakra, 7th chakra. The angels Gabriel, Raphael, Uriel, Michael, Samuel, Zachariel, or Raphael, in terms of ages of man: infancy, boyhood, adolescence, young manhood, man, age, decrepitude. Letters B, G, D, K, P, R, T. And so I have the 7 double letters. I have the ages of man. I have the 7 planets. Now I go to Iran. And what do? I create the first ziggurat. And the ziggurat becomes 7 levels, starting with the moon and going down to Saturn. 7 colors, 7 days, and linked then, and it's positioned so that it's like a diamond shape. See, this is south and that corner is north. So it's like your diamond triangle of your horoscope charts. Yes? And of course, this then becomes This starts in Iran, but then moves to Iraq and Babylon and all the great ziggurats of. So the ziggurats are not just temples; they are models of the 7 double letters and of the 7 planets. And I can draw that as a circle. And this is used in the mystical tradition, which may reflect the Alcyon cycle of one of the planets. But if I go to Samarra, I actually build such a temple. And in one of the great mosques of Cairo, you have a mini Samarra. So, again, I look at the heavens, I associate it with I figure out how the planets work. I make a geometry of that. Then I build a geometry, and that geometry becomes one of the ways that I worship God. Now, most people just look at this and say, well, an interesting tower. But the tower is, in fact, a whole universe of ordering, so to speak. Well, here is, speaking of ordering and universe, here is the Hindu version. So I have a great turtle on whom I have 4 elephants. In the early Russian version, there are only 3, but the Hindus have 4. Then we have a round earth, and then I have my Saptaloka. Yes? This is the Chaldean model of the universe. So there's the Saptaloka, Saptaloka. This is the Babylonian universe, Saptaloka. And here is the purgatory of the Christian system, Saptaloka copied, without the copyright sign. And so suddenly, once you realize this, I mean, in that one picture, you see that the model of the universe that the Hindus created in ordering their world as 7 places, linking up, of course, with 7 islands and 7 mountains and 7 rivers, the Sapta Sindhu, which become the Hapta Hindu when you go to Iran. The whole universe is connected through this system. And since this is also connected with the letters, we start to see that the letter ordering is an ordering of the whole of the cosmos. And when we get to the Hebrews, well, they start by building tents in the desert, but then they build more complicated versions, and what do? They have their man, just as we call it Vitruvian man, but in fact we saw that he's also in Borobudur. But here now he's a man, and he becomes the Kabbalistic man, linked with the 7 planets and linked with the 10 Zephiroth and with the chakras again. And we see very interesting things. So we all know about the linga, some more than others, but from when I was growing up, I thought the linga was just some nice little pole. They didn't tell me with the other meanings. But then, if you look closely at a linga, it's 3. That is to say, the square is a base, linked with Brahma. The middle point is 8-sided, linked with Vishnu, and the top is round, linked with Shiva. Now, if you go to Patan, in which we are, just a few hundred yards away, and you look closely at the pillars, you will notice that they have these 3 sides. And in lecture 13, I will show you that the great mosques of the Muslims, and in fact the column in front, or the tower in front of the Church of St. Paul outside the walls of Rome, follow this same pattern. And now it gets interesting, because the word for Mecca is actually Makkah. Makkah. And Makkah is a Sanskrit word. And Makkah was known as, you remember how Vishnu takes 3 steps in his 4th avatar? I think it's his 4th avatar, where he's a little boy and he takes these 3 enormous steps. Well, and where he takes those steps differs, because one says he starts in Gaya or Bodh Gaya, and then he goes to Kashi, and then one further. But in one of the versions, he goes to Mecca. And if you go to Mecca, you find an 8-sided building, which has a foot of Vishnu in it, which of course now has been renamed a footprint of Muhammad, but it was originally a Hindu place of worship. And the 8-sided, of course, links up with this 8-sided ordering of the universe of the Chinese, which we saw also links up with the 8 animals and the 8 movements of animals. And in the Christian tradition, what you call Vishnu becomes linked with baptism or rebirth, and so the baptistry becomes linked with 8 sides. So you have a cube which you unfold, and it becomes a church, and that is Christ. And then the baptistry is in front of the church, and that is John the Baptist. So Christ and John the Baptist, cube or cross and octagon become the 2 most important holy people of Christianity, 2 most important buildings. Now I take a square and put another square at right angles, at 45 degrees like this. It becomes the Star of Lakshmi, which becomes the Rub al-Hidh in Islam. And in Malaysia, you had a prime minister called Mr. Mahathir. He sat down one day and said, "Oh, this would be a good thing if I took that shape and added a little circle here. I could make an interesting tower." The Petronas Towers are based on this sacred symbol, which is based on the Star of Lakshmi, which of course is also based on your horoscope star. And so that combination of 2 squares can create this symbol and becomes the basics of how you make fountains. Then you have a hexagon represents the sun, and an octagon represents the moon. So you have a mosque with a cemetery, moon and sun, and that becomes then a church and a circle. A church and a circle in Pisa, and a church and an octagon in Florence. And so things that start in the east go to the west, and those same basic forms of squares and octagons and so on become the basics then also of your maps, your flags and national symbols. And then later versions combine the 2 in the same building. Of course, I don't mean to say that the Roman Church in Palmyra, the Arabic church or mosque in Istanbul, and the Christian churches here are all the same. What I'm saying is there's an underlying pattern that applies to all of these very different cultures and very different religions. And if we stand back now and look cosmically, we see that there is a difference between the 6 and the 8, between the cube and the octahedron, between sound and light, the bell and the vajra, the jhana and jnana, between the womb world and the diamond world, between Shukra, Venus, and Mars, Lakshmi and Venus, the winter solstice and the summer solstice, in Christian terms between Christ and John the Baptist, between being reborn and born, between cube and octagonal building. And in some versions, this becomes the contrast between Jerusalem and Mecca, between the west and the east, the setting sun and the rising sun, the octagon and the square, the evening star and the morning star, the archetypal order and the temporal order. And in the Hebrew tradition, the seven, that gives us the 7 churches and the 7 days, and which comes, of course, from the 7 lokas and the 7 everythings. It becomes a way of linking 7 candles, and then that becomes a way of organizing the 22 letters, and it becomes a way of organizing the chapters of the Bible. So there are 22 letters, but there are also 22 books, which then break up, or not break up, but are organized in terms of this candle. And the candle can have various forms. Here's a modern version of what's called the menorah. And of course, I need not remind you, that is very closely linked then to that world tree that we saw at the beginning, which is also linked again to the chakras. And here you see various organization of the 3 cycles of 22 books, which gives you then the 66 books. And so the organizing of the letters becomes an organizing of the books of the Bible. It's their version of the Vedas. So the organizing of the letters are the same as the organizing of the books of the letters, so to speak. And then you create various versions of this 6 or 7 candles. In Latvia and Lithuania, you create extraordinary ones like this. In the early Christian church, you just built 7 candles. And in medieval Christianity here in Braunschweig, you have 7 candles organized like this. And this 7 is then much more than just 7 candles. It links with the 7 planets in Babylon, which can be rearranged like this, or it can be done as a spiral. So remember how the spiral starts with it really starts with the umbilicus, and it links then with the women's things. But of course you can have the 2 spirals, which, remember, goes back to the upward one of the chakras, upwards and downwards. It can be linked this way to the planets. It can be linked this way, where the letters are linked now with the months of the year. Or we can create this extraordinary map where we have the 7 days of creation, the 7 planets, the 7 metals, the 7 chakras, the 7 notes, the 7 liberal arts, and the 7 alchemical processes. And so what begins as just a candle becomes a way of organizing the whole of knowledge. And even the order in which you light and turn off the candles has a deep significance. So once you have mastered the world, then you can create a whole set of systems. So in the early system, you have, this is in Babylon, you have the moon linked with B, G, and D, the letters Beth, Gimel, and Daleth, Moon, Mercury, and Venus, the sun linked with K, P, R, T, Sun, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, and this gives you a 3 by 3 cube. This leads you to, square. This is a 4 by 4, a 5 by 5, a 6 by 6, 7 by 7, 8 by 8, and 9 by 9. In terms of, if you take those first 9 numbers and add them together, in a row you get 15. If you add the whole thing, it gets 45. So you get a whole series of mystical numbers. So you have 7 letters, but the 7 letters give you 2 sets of, it gives you the 7 planets, it gives you 2 sets of magical numbers, which you can then organize the universe. Then you get the moon alpha order, the descending, the exhale, And then the inhale gives you this, and you get then the 3 become the trivium, and the 4 become the quadrivium. So the trivium is grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric, and the quadrivium is arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. And so that links up then also then with the 7 sounds, the 7 parts of the body, the 7 metals, the 7 theological virtues, and the 7 days of creation. And so by just having 7 letters, I have the whole of the world. Sorry. And what I can then do is take those 22 letters and organize them from outer, beyond the stars to the stars, and then the planets, ending up with the 4 elements, and I have a model for the whole universe. And here are 2 other versions. In the here, Queen Elizabeth I has got the whole world in her hands, so to speak. And you then start to create what's called microcosm-macrocosm diagrams, where the microcosm of the human body becomes a model for how you organize the whole of the universe. So you have theory and practice, you have 4 elements that then get linked up with a whole set of other things, and you create that kind of diagram. Or you create one man, and then he gets linked up with various things. Or you have, in Sumeria, you have a snake, and he's like your Naga, and the Naga becomes a way of organizing the whole of space, and this becomes one of the first games. So now moving from the outward to the inward, or from the inward to the outward, becomes a way of not only playing with the world, but recreating the world through a game, a topic to which I'll return in chapter 12. But that is a first glimpse of how what begins as an attempt to do the rules of speaking becomes a rule of how you breathe and live, how you move, and then how the whole of the universe moves.